Alright, so we're going to start genetics this week. I just want to give you a brief introduction to some stuff that I think you'll probably already be kind of familiar with, so we can kind of get it out of the way and start using it already this week. So, genetics. This is the branch of science that studies how the characteristics of living organisms are inherited. And we already know that the genes that we inherit are found on our DNA. Alright, so a trait is any characteristic determined by your DNA. Trait is just a general term we can use to describe these things. And these are things like your eye color, hair color, height, any other physical characteristic you can think of. Also, if your hair is curly or straight. And again, these are things you inherit and you also will pass on to your offspring. Alright, so this word may be new to you. Allele. So an allele is a specific version of a gene. So I've kind of alluded to this before. So here in this picture you can see you have a set of homologous chromosomes. In our cells in particular, we have 23 pairs of homologous chromosomes to give us a total of 46 chromosomes. On the homologous chromosomes, they have all of the same genes. So here, for example, it's showing you flower color for the chromosomes of a flower. So an allele is a different version of that gene. So one gene may be for purple flowers, and another gene might be for white flowers. So you could think the same for hair color for us. On a pair of homologous chromosomes, whichever one has hair color, one chromosome could have a brown-haired gene, the other could have a blonde-haired gene. So, the different versions are just called an allele. Alright, so here is sort of the basics. This is going to look like a lot of information, but it's just explaining how everything you already learned ties in together. So, for each inherited characteristic, an organism has two genes. These genes are found on the set of homologous chromosomes. So hopefully that makes sense. You have two chromosome 1s, two chromosomes 2s, two chromosome 3s, all the way through, your sex chromosomes XX or XY. You have two genes because you have two of those chromosomes. So two genes for any trait, and again, these are found on homologous chromosomes, like I just explained. So these homologous chromosomes, you get one from each of your parents. So one chromosome 1 came from your mom, the other chromosome 1 came from your dad, and the same for all of them. So during fertilization, a sperm and an egg, they each have one copy or one allele for each trait, one gene for each trait. And they're able to do this because the egg and sperm are haploid, and they're haploid because of meiosis. Once fertilization happens and those egg and sperm come together, you then have a diploid cell with two genes for every trait. So the combination of alleles will determine what trait the organism gets, and this is going to be a lot of what we talk about here in genetics, predicting what combinations will give you what traits. And the two different alleles are on the same part of the chromosome as well. So you can see here both of the alleles they're highlighting in this image are at the same location on the chromosome. We call this the locus. And if you remember from the chromosome disorders we talked about, that locus is very important. And whenever the genes get shuffled around accidentally, that's when you can get certain disorders. Alright, so dominant versus recessive alleles. So it's considered dominant when it's the stronger of the two genes, which all that means is if it's present, that's the trait you'll see. And we represent that with a capital letter. Recessive then is the gene or the allele that tends to get masked by the dominant one, and we represent that with a lowercase letter. And you probably remember these from when you did Punnett squares back in the day. So, when the dominant gene is present, the dominant phenotype will be shown. We'll talk about that word in a minute. So, let's say, for example, capital R represents a purple flower, and lowercase r represents a white flower. So, flower color is the gene we're talking about. Purple and white are the two different alleles for that gene. So, if an individual has two alleles that are both dominant, we call that individual homozygous. Homo, again, means same, so they're same of the same letter. So homozygous dominant because both are the dominant allele. This individual will have purple flowers. If they are heterozygous, which means they have one dominant and one recessive allele, they will have purple flowers. They'll show the dominant trait. And if they have both recessive alleles, we call that homozygous recessive. And these terms here, the homozygous dominant, heterozygous, homozygous recessive, those are important to understand. This individual then will have the white flowers. A couple more terms to introduce, which you will probably see around. Anytime you have a homozygous individual for a certain trait, we can call that purebred. Doesn't mean the same thing as you usually would call it, like when you refer to a dog, a purebred dog. This is like a different context. And then the heterozygous individual we actually will call hybrid. So there's a few more words you may see around. Alright, so genotype versus phenotype. These are very simple. So, genotype genes. So this is referring to the gene combination that you have for a trait. The phenotype, think physical. This relates to the physical trait or characteristic expressed by the gene. You could also think phenotype protein. Both start with a P. So the phenotype refers to, the protein which is the expression of the genotype. The protein really is our trait. So, another example, so the genotype of an organism is the combination of alleles that are present. So here are a few examples. So if your allele, we're using a B to represent that, here are your three possible genotypes for that trait. So again, homozygous, two identical alleles. Heterozygous, there's two different alleles. One dominant, one recessive. Phenotype, again, think physical. So the appearance is due to the organism's genotype. So going back to our true and false from transcription and translation, the genes determine the physical characteristics. The genes determine the proteins. The genes determine the phenotype. So, with these two gene combinations, genotypes, you would have this phenotype. With this genotype, you'd get this phenotype. Alright, so next we'll talk about the man who made this all possible, but for now, this is what you should know for today.